folks, welcome back to the channel, and we are on our show segment, Major League Broadcasting. That's MLB to short form it, and we're so happy to have a very unique guest on today. His name is Mark Ford, and we're talking on our first overseas call in Japan this morning. 13 hours ahead is Mark. Mark, thank you for staying up. Welcome to the channel, and please introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, thanks very much, MLB. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Mark Ford, born in Toronto, raised in Uxbridge, been living in Japan for the past 25 years. I originally came here working on aerospace projects, and from there I went into strategy consulting and banking. I've been running my own private equity turnaround shop since about the year 2002, and also investing in ventures.
Well, I heard in your bio something about a scientist. Can you expand a little bit on that for that background for the listeners?
Sure. In the snapshot is I'm a scientist, entrepreneur, and engineer. And so I started off in astrophysics from University of Toronto. From there, I went into aerospace engineering, studied in Boston, worked on microgravitational fluid mechanics, high-altitude, long-endurance aerospace platforms. That brought me to Japan. So that's my scientific background. In the course of developing ventures, I got heavily involved in biotechnology, especially immuno-oncology, bacteriophage platforms for fighting cancer and other infectious diseases.
Now, our topic today, which is certainly, I know, having Lucas, my engineer, interested very much, and myself, of course. In our pre-game chat, we talked about bringing the audience the link from overseas to, I'm going to say North America, because that's where we're situated, as you know, on this pandemic called COVID-19. And I want to start with you today asking that question. How did it start, or what did you hear about it, or where was Japan or the Orient, if you will, where were they involved? You know, let's get into the link from overseas to North America at least, please.
Sure. And let me preface it by saying I'm not a physician or an epidemiologist, so this is a bit of my armchair observations from where I'm sitting here in Tokyo. MLB, I brushed shoulders with it in January. My father was scheduled to come to Japan and join me from Uxbridge. And I told him, I said, Dad, there seems to be a new kind of flu going around. Why don't you just hold off for a week or so? And that was 8 months ago. And you know how, of course, it developed since then. As far as Japan is concerned, the big news hit with that well-known incident with the cruise ship that was parked off Yokohama. And you may be familiar with that, yes, where about half of the passengers came down with COVID-19. That was basically the start. Japan took very aggressive measures early on after it kind of got its act together, banning flights from China and so on and so forth. But if I look at kind of the trajectory and the actions that were taken here versus what has been done in Canada and the United States, again, it's anecdotal, but there may be some interesting insights people can draw from that.
So did it start in China? There's been many speculations that it was some backwoods town, suburbs somewhere, and eating something, the wrong food or bacteria on a food. Give us the data that you know of overseas.
Right. So, I can't speak authoritatively. And in that regard, most of the information that we have here as to where it started is going to be similar to what you have there, with one exception. The political filter, I think, isn't as strong perhaps over here. It's strong in other ways, but not perhaps in the way that you are seeing it in North America as it is in Japan. You're familiar with Japan and the history of its relationship with the neighbors, so things tend to be a little bit more unvarnished here. At the same time, there's also their own form of bias. The general take on it over here is that it's no question it came from the laboratory. It was probably an accident. The Chinese government knew about it, and they botched it, and it's that simple. And the World Health Organization has basically been in the back pocket of China. That is a very popular viewpoint here, and for those reasons, a lot of countries got off to the wrong start because they relied heavily on an organization that was providing heavily biased information.
So was it a lot of fake news? And then this thing, they thought they could contain it, and then it went out of control. And I understand these are only your opinions, but we value your opinions because you are in another time zone, another area of the world, and we have no reflection how the people of Japan feel things are being handled, how they feel what happened, the wrongdoing perhaps that happened. We're looking for your opinion because, sir, you are there, we aren't. And then I want to talk about your views on perhaps some of the mistakes the rest of the world, meaning North America and Europe, probably fake news or mistakes that we've made too. Tell us how the population over in Asia is generally feeling about it now and how it was handled.
Sure. Well, I think the interesting thing about having lived here for such a long time, there are two lessons. One is when I first came here, I probably learned far more about Canada than I did about Japan, simply being outside the matrix and seeing how things work. The other thing is there's a universality in the way that people tend to look at things. And in that regard, many of the Japanese early on had distrust of the government. They felt that there was cover-ups, that they weren't taking appropriate measures and so forth. A lot of the sentiments that we see in Canada and the US vis-a-vis the government's response, we also saw here in Japan. And so in that sense, as far as the government response is concerned and the data that was coming out in your question about fake news, a lot of people in Japan felt early on that the numbers were being underreported, that the government wasn't being forthcoming with the facts. As for the actual trend, we are now in the second wave, which is pretty much double the peak of what the first wave was. And I think a lot of the sort of fog of war against this disease is being sorted out, but more remains unknown.
Do you feel when I say you folks, you people, I'm talking about you being around the other side of the world? Do you feel you've got a handle on it? You've mentioned phase 2 is peaking or not. We aren't seeing numbers the way we saw them in phase 1 about, China specifically was peaking out of control. We aren't hearing too much of that international information. Light overtone, it's basically right now about how the U.S. has botched their phase 1 and phase 2, and pretty much the rest of the world got caught with their pants down around their ankles. Italy, Spain, other things, and of course China. We didn't hear about Japan as being heavy. But of course, now the Mecca in the States, the California, New York, Floridas, Arizona's, we're out of control again. When I say we, being a neighboring country, we are out of control. Canada is, we're probably in the best shape of everyone, but the States is out of control. So tell us a little bit about where some of the mistakes were made.
Right. So it's kind of useful to do these country-to-country comparisons in so far as the following is concerned. The one fixed point is the virus itself, and this is the virus is, and we try to understand it and approximate it as best as possible. We may not really ever truly know what something is in nature, but our expectations are fully under control, not the least of which is controlled by culture. And culture really matters in this situation because the virus is the virus. And when we see approaches to science and we see public policy and opinions of the layman on the street and so forth, it's heavily entwined with culture and perception and bias. So I think if I was to make some very rudimentary comparisons to Tokyo versus New York. Generally speaking, in Tokyo, Japan, people tend to follow the rules. There is a kind of a respect or a mindfulness, whether or not you like your fellow citizen, there's that mindfulness of your fellow citizen. So when it comes to manners and politeness and so forth, that's very much part of the culture here. And that extended to behaviors vis-a-vis the virus. Masks have always been in use in Japan, I think, since the 1920s, when there was an epidemic domestically back then. So there wasn't a kind of a stigma or it's weird, why are people wearing masks? It's kind of habitual in the society for people to wear masks. But MLB, there are some other factors too. Generally speaking, the Japanese are fastidious about hygiene. If some of the studies that I've seen, about half of all Japanese wash their hands after going to the toilet, compared to something like 20 or 30% of North Americans. They don't wear their shoes in the house. When you think about it, shoes are absolutely filthy. They contain all kinds of pathogens, fecal matter. You're on the street where people are vomiting and dogs are defecating and so on. And people will walk in the house with those shoes on in North America, on the bed and so forth. So, I mean, that sort of thing. In the subways, people don't talk on their cell phones here. They certainly don't eat. It's considered rude. Compare that to a New York subway or even the TTC. And so those practices, I think, made a difference, a measurable difference. The other thing that is pure speculation on my part, when we look at trajectory in Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, it is different to North America, especially the United States. And my working theory behind this is, in Japan, half the population doesn't hate and despise the other half, and nor is it so in South Korea or Taiwan or Hong Kong. It's definitely true in the United States, where half of the population loathes the other half, and politics is entwined in everything, and tribalism and identity politics and so on, and that's also manifests itself in Canada as well. You see that all the time. So those cultural things, I think, play a very, very significant role. Now, as far as things that Japan could do better and could have done better, these kind of disasters like the Fukushima disaster and so forth, they tend to be disasters that are uniquely made in Japan, where the first response is no response. It's analysis paralysis. So the government bureaucrats are kind of looking at each other and wondering what to do. Nobody wants to take a step because of punishment. Nobody wants to take a risk and stand out. And shortly after that comes suppression of information. And then after information leaks and works its way out, they can't contain it anymore. And then some kind of public policy measure is put in place, which is more or less effective. We saw that in Fukushima with the nuclear meltdowns. The Olympics, of course, theoretically just happened. That's an interesting story in itself, because up until, a month or so before the Olympics, Japan was adamant, Tokyo was adamant, no, the Olympics will continue, the show must go on, until Canada, I think, was the first to say, hey, we're not coming to the party. And then the US, and then all the other countries said we're not coming, and the bureaucrats here were forced to capitulate and say, oh, okay, we have a face-saving way out of this. So those are some of the cultural shortcomings we see on this side that could exacerbate problems like a pandemic.
What is life, everyday life now, today? Well, unfairly today because your day finished, but what was your typical day today on restrictions, people's behavior? You mentioned masking. Are people crazy about the situation happening, or is it now a way of life, or things settling down? You mentioned phase 2. Tell us a little bit about everyday life now, because you're farther into it than we are in North America and, of course, in Europe.
Sure. In the first few months, there were government measures in which there was a lot of teleworking and people were encouraged to stay home, and public events and gatherings and going out to restaurants and so forth were either restricted or discouraged. For the most part, those tended to be, if I understood it correctly, tended to be voluntary measures. And people were concerned. They took whatever measures they could, washing hands, not walking in the house with their shoes on, wearing masks and so forth. But they still went about their daily business as best as possible. For example, in the area that I live in, Tokyo, Sakata Shinmachi, it's very much a residential area. And people still went on about their business, shopping at the local market and so forth. The streets were still full. And people conducted their business. Now, with this kind of second wave, and the restrictions have been officially lifted, we're seeing perhaps a bit of carelessness, especially among people in their 20s and 30s. The hostess bars and the host bars and the drinking establishments are full. Hot time, summer in the city, Friday night. All the young people out there, and about 60 or 70% of the cases, as I understand it, are springing up in people in their 20s and 30s, simply because they're not being careful. They're going out, they're drinking, and they're in close proximity to other people. And so I would say that the general sentiment is one of concern, certainly not panic. The other thing is that people are wondering what the government plan is now. They really haven't come out with it. They had something in the beginning. They relaxed it, but okay, what's the next act? I think that's probably a reasonable description of what's going on over here.
Now, is it everyday life now under acceptance that this is how things are going to be indefinite? We're being told here that, COVID-19 now is part of the flu schedule of systems that are going to be added down to the bugs that are strains that are going to be involved here on our way of life. How are you folks looking at it overseas? And maybe give your opinion on scientifically where you feel the disease is going.
Sure. So Japan really had an opportunity to stamp it out early on, and they took measures that kind of almost did it, but they didn't go far enough. And so the cat's out of the bag over here, and I don't think they can get behind it now. And from my colleagues and physicians and so forth who I talk to, Japanese and American and Canadian who work here, they pretty much have that same sentiment. Again, not being an epidemiologist, I'm just giving kind of our impressions and take on it. And so I think for the most part, people think that this is going to be around to stay. I think there's perhaps a false sense of hope that once a vaccine comes out, then everything will be hunky-dory and we can go back to the way things were. And I think that's a misperception. I don't know if that's the kind of sentiment that you're encountering in Canada, but I have encountered that here. But I don't think people believe that this is going away in the near future. And the physicians that I speak to say a year, at least.
Now, your company that you're involved with is working on a drug vaccine. I know you can't get into all of the ABCs, but can you tell where that project's going? I know it was at the FDA level testing for approval. I don't want to know names, don't want to pry, but is it something you feel is needed and something you think is going to help with the problem?
Well, sure. I can speak in general terms. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry has a vaccine in the works. And the reality is most of the big government money was sucked up early on by large pharmaceutical players. And so if you're a small company or an also-ran trying to get into it at this stage, you have to fund it yourself, and which essentially means you're not going to be funding it. Although there may be very, very good technologies with a smaller fry, there's an election coming up. somebody needs a very strong message in October. And it's no surprise that funding from government agencies are going to be channeled to those bets, which one would think will give the best bang for the buck, at least in terms of a good news message coming out prior to the election. There is something else, MLB, that is important to recognize, and that has to do with the level of commitment and the sincerity behind the vaccine or vaccines. And if you look at these very large pharmaceutical players, these are 70, 80, $100 billion companies, and they're putting $50, $80 million into a vaccine, which is really a drop in the bucket. And so when, we, behind closed doors, talking to the pharmaceutical companies, talking to the investment bankers and analysts on the street who are familiar with these kinds of conversations, the dirty little secret is that, well, look, nobody in the big pharma is out to get a vaccine, okay? Because you really can't make money from it. It's great marketing. It's great to project, hey, I'm a big pharma and look what a great corporate citizen I am. I'm developing this vaccine. But, from a profit standpoint, they know where their bread is buttered. It's in their other drug portfolio items. And by perhaps currying favor or impressing regulators with a COVID-19 position, that perhaps makes them look better for approval of the more profitable drugs in their pipeline. So there's, some opportunism is in there. And I think, frankly speaking, if I can be so bold, this is the same thing with companies and other industries with other political issues like Nike's donations or statements about Black Lives Matter. I don't for a minute believe that a big corporation like Nike, considering what they do to workers in this part of the world, has any, over abiding virtue with respect to BLM. But a BLM donation basically exonerates them and say, hey, look, you can't label me a racist. Look how tolerant I am. Whether or not that's actually sincere expression of tolerance is a completely separate issue. Likewise for the pharma, I think, in the COVID-19, it may be a bit of a stretch and people may argue against that, I understand, but I don't see the sincerity of the commitment by big pharma from a financial standpoint to the vaccine.
So, Mark, you mentioned numerous vaccines out there. Time's pushing on. We got about 1 minute to go. We're going to ask you, obviously, to come back another time to be our COVID-19 updater, certainly from overseas, on a quick 30-second answer. And it may be tough, but I want you to say, do you and your company have the magic in the bottle to put this COVID-19 to bed? Yes or no? And if it's maybe, tell me about the maybe.
Absolutely not, and nobody does. And nobody will.
Okay, now, if our viewers want to connect with you, give a shout out to your social media presence. Somebody may be listening and say, hey, Mark Ford's a cool guy. I want to talk to him. How can they get to you?
Sure. Shoot me a mail at info@moneo.jp, info@moneo, M as in Mike, O-N as in November, EO.jp as in Japan.
Listen, it's been wonderful catching up with you. I hope you will find it interesting, our chat today, and want to come back. We appreciate your time. Folks, you've been listening to Major League Broadcasting, MLB. I am the BMD, your host of the day, and we were fortunate to have scientist engineer Mark Ford all the way overseas from Japan. Mark, you and your family stay well, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks very much, Emily. Take care. Bye-bye.